A great unraveling is happening right now across the United States, something the government refuses to track, something the mainstream media barely whispers about, and yet it is accelerating faster than any official statistic can capture. It is a quiet stampede, a silent evacuation of the country's most skilled, most resourceful citizens, and it is taking place under the cover of a manipulated economic narrative. I can see it in the faces of the people I meet, the tightness around the eyes, the forced smiles that do not reach the cheeks, the way a man will lower his voice in a grocery aisle when he tells you what he really thinks. I hear it in the desperate phone calls from listeners, calls that come in late at night, voices cracking, people who have never spoken to a stranger about their fear now pouring it out because they have nowhere else to turn. And I track it in datasets the press refuses to touch, spreadsheets I keep on my own desk, columns of numbers that tell a story no anchor will read aloud. More and more Americans, working professionals, skilled nurses, engineers, small business owners, and entire families are packing their bags and fleeing the country as if they were escaping a sinking ship. They are not just vacationing. They are liquidating their 401ks, selling their overpriced homes for whatever they can get, and pulling their kids out of schools to start over in nations that still value human dignity. And make no mistake, the ship is sinking. The data I have assembled paints a picture so grim, so catastrophic in its implications, that you may find yourself questioning everything you have been told about our so-called economic recovery. The hull has been breached by decades of elite greed and policy malpractice, and the water is rising faster than the deckhands can bail. You can hear it if you listen. The groan of the timbers, the slow tilt of the deck beneath your feet, the way the horizon no longer sits where it used to. What you are about to hear is not a forecast. It is an autopsy of a society in its final stages of metastatic decay. We are witnessing the beginnings of a population hemorrhage, a brain drain, a silent vote of no confidence from the very citizens this country was built to serve. And the volume of that vote is growing louder by the week. It is a middle finger from the middle class, a rejection of the entire rigged game, a desperate flight from a nation that has become a predator against its own people. We humbly ask you to support our work with a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming warnings. Because what we are about to discuss is not some distant hypothetical. It is unfolding in real time in every major metropolitan area, in the hollowed-out manufacturing towns, and even in the once thriving suburbs that now resemble ghost towns of foreclosed dreams. I have driven through those suburbs, the lawns going to seed, the basketball hoops rusting over empty driveways, the for sale signs that never seem to come down. If you have been feeling that something is terribly wrong, that the numbers on the television do not match your grocery bill or your rent check, you are not alone. That gap between what they tell you and what your own wallet tells you is not your imagination. It is the single most honest thing left in this economy. By subscribing and hitting that bell, you join a community of clear-eyed Americans who refuse to be gaslit. The exodus I am about to describe is the final verdict on a failed system, and you need to know its full dimensions before it swamps your own future. To understand how we arrived at this precipice, we must first acknowledge the sheer scale of the disillusionment. According to a recent Gallup survey, the percentage of Americans who say they would permanently leave the United States if they had the opportunity has surged to an all-time high of 21%. That survey was conducted just before the holidays, a time when people typically feel most anchored to family and tradition, when the smell of cooking fills the house and the old photographs come down off the shelves. Yet a record share said they would jump ship. Think about what it takes to feel that way in December, surrounded by everyone and everything you love, and still conclude that your future lies somewhere else entirely. Among those under 30 years old, the number jumps to a staggering 24%. When 1 in 4 young adults would abandon their homeland, you know the social contract has been shattered. Among the 18 to 29 cohort, that 24% represents millions of young adults who have come of age in a nation of permanent war, endless debt, and zero trust in institutions. They have never known a booming, broadly shared prosperity. They have only known the promise of it, dangled and withdrawn, and it gets worse. The Internal Revenue Service tracks expatriations, those who formally renounce their citizenship, and the numbers have been climbing relentlessly. In 2024, more than 4,800 individuals formally turned in their passports, and while that fell short of the all-time record of nearly 6,700 set in 2020, that figure still grossly underestimates the true outflow because it does not count the millions of legal residents and dual citizens who simply pack up and leave without filing a single form. Renouncing citizenship is not like canceling a gym membership. It requires a face-to-face interview at an embassy, a fee of over $2,000, and permanent separation from the only home many have ever known. Picture the weight of that appointment, the drive to the embassy, the last time you hand over that blue passport across a counter and walk out a stranger to the country of your birth. Yet nearly 5,000 people paid that price last year, and they are just the visible tip. The United Nations estimates that the American diaspora abroad has swelled to nearly 10 million, and the growth rate over the past 3 years has been unlike anything we have seen since the draft-dodging era of Vietnam. The UN's data shows that number was around 6 million 2 decades ago, meaning the rate of growth has tripled. That is not tourism. That is a permanent redistribution of human capital. Only this time, people are not fleeing a war abroad. They are fleeing a war at home, a war on the middle class, a war on your savings, a war on your sanity, waged by the very institutions that are supposed to protect you. To truly grasp the magnitude of this exodus, we need to dissect the engine that drives it. And the primary fuel, the spark that has ignited this fire, is a healthcare system so profoundly broken that it can no longer be called a system at all. It is an extraction racket, a predatory machine designed to transfer wealth from the sick and the vulnerable to a cabal of insurance executives, hospital conglomerates, and pharmaceutical middlemen. The Kaiser Family Foundation released its annual employer health benefits survey, and the numbers should make every working American furious. The average annual premium for a family plan has now surpassed $25,000. $25,000. Say it slowly and let it sink in. That is more than a full-time minimum wage worker earns in an entire year, and it is money you pay before you even walk through a doctor's door. Since the year 2000, family premiums have increased 240%, while median earnings have risen just 54%. That gap is a chasm that has swallowed the American dream whole. And then the real nightmare begins. Deductibles have soared to an average of $3,500 for an individual before insurance pays a dime. But many plans now carry deductibles of $6,000 or more. So you are paying a mortgage-sized premium for the privilege of paying for all your own care up to a threshold that would bankrupt half the country. Co-pays, co-insurance, out-of-pocket maximums, surprise bills, networks that narrow by the day, and the infamous practice of balance billing, where an out-of-network anesthesiologist you never met can send you a bill for tens of thousands of dollars after a surgery you thought was covered. You wake up in the recovery room groggy and grateful to be alive, and weeks later the envelope arrives, and it is thicker than any get-well card. We are the only developed nation on Earth where a medical emergency is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy. A study from the American Journal of Public Health found that 2/3 of all bankruptcies in the United States are tied to medical debt. 2/3. And here is the most sickening twist. The vast majority of those who went bankrupt had health insurance at the time they got sick. A follow-up by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that medical debt is now the single largest category of collections debt, exceeding credit cards and auto loans. So you pay your premiums faithfully, you think you are protected, and then the fine print, the pre-authorization denials, the out-of-network traps, the lifetime caps in disguise, they all converge to destroy your financial life just when you are at your most vulnerable. This is not a flaw. It is the design. The system is engineered to extract your last dollar while you are too sick to fight, to reach into your pocket at the exact moment your hands are too weak to stop it. I remember back in the early 1970s when I was growing up, my father had a decent union job, and our family had a single health insurance plan that covered everything. No deductibles, no co-pays, no endless paperwork. You got sick, you went to the doctor, you got better, and you never saw a bill. That was the norm for middle-class America. I can still smell the antiseptic of Dr. Wilson's office, that sharp, clean sting of rubbing alcohol mixed with the faint sweetness of the lollipops he kept in a glass jar on the counter. I remember the crinkle of the paper on the examination table, the tick of the wall clock, the reassuring weight of his hand on my shoulder. He was a kindly old man who knew my name and never asked about insurance because he knew the Blue Cross card in my father's wallet was all he needed. He knew my mother's name too, and my grandmother's, and he would ask after all of them before he ever put the cold end of the stethoscope to my chest. There was trust then, a social contract between healer and patient that has been replaced by a thicket of CPT codes and prior authorizations designed by MBAs to deny care. Today, that same security is a distant memory. And now we have reached a new level of absurdity so grotesque that it almost defies belief. Just the other day, a young man I know shared his recent experience at a routine checkup. The nurse, as part of the intake, asked him the standard 2 questions. Do you drink alcohol? How many drinks per week? That casual conversation, that simple inquiry that takes 10 seconds, was coded as an alcohol screening and billed to him for $50. $25 per question. He showed me the bill, a 3-page statement with codes that looked like alien script, columns of abbreviations and modifiers that no ordinary human being was ever meant to decipher. And sure enough, there it was. Alcohol misuse screening, 15 minutes, $50. He did not spend 15 minutes. He spent 10 seconds answering 2 innocent questions, and yet that line item was non-negotiable. His insurance had a preventive care loophole that excluded screenings if you answered a certain way, so the burden fell entirely on him. He said he felt violated, like he had been mugged in broad daylight by someone wearing a lab coat. No warning, no consent, just a stealth charge buried in the fine print of his explanation of benefits. He told me his hands were actually shaking as he read it, not from the money itself but from the sheer insolence of it, the way they had reached into his pocket while smiling and calling it care. And since he was paying out of pocket because his so-called insurance did not cover that visit, he had to pay the $50 in full. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of office visits, and you begin to see the scale of the theft. They are not just billing for real work. They are billing for the oxygen you breathe while you wait, for the paper gown you shiver in, for the nurse's smile. It is a racket, pure and simple. This is not healthcare. This is institutionalized usury. Compare that to the experience of another American I heard from recently, a woman traveling in Portugal. A girl on her tour sprained an ankle, stepping wrong off a curb on a cobblestone street, and when the guide offered to call an ambulance, the American reflexively panicked, thinking of the thousands of dollars it would cost. You could see the color drain from her face, the old conditioned dread rising up before she even had time to think. The guide, confused, explained that an ambulance ride in Portugal costs about €8. X-rays, another €8. €16 total for emergency transport and diagnostic imaging. At that moment, the American reportedly joked, "Can I go on the ambulance for fun?" But the laughter contained a deep, bitter truth. The woman told me later that she actually broke down crying in the hotel room that night, sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed with the sound of a foreign city drifting up through the window, not from the sprained ankle, but from the realization that in her homeland, that same incident could have cost $5,000 and a 6-month battle with collections. The contrast was so stark it broke something inside her. She started researching visa requirements before her flight home, thumbing through pages on her phone in the dark while her friends slept. Americans are now so conditioned to being financially terrorized by their own healthcare system that they view basic medical care as a luxury, and that realization is driving thousands upon thousands of skilled professionals to simply leave. Nurses, doctors, specialists, the very people we desperately need, are voting with their feet. I have spoken with a relocation consultant who specializes in helping American healthcare workers move abroad, and she told me her client list has tripled in just 2 years. They are heading to Scotland, to Australia, to New Zealand, to anywhere that treats medical care as a human right rather than a commodity to be strip-mined. She described one nurse, a 34-year-old single mother from Ohio, who took a job in Glasgow. The starting salary was lower on paper, but after factoring in free healthcare, free university for her daughter, and a rent-controlled apartment near a world-class hospital, her disposable income and peace of mind skyrocketed. The consultant told me the nurse cried on the phone when she described walking her daughter to school past the old stone buildings, breathing in the cold, damp air, and realizing for the first time in years that she was not doing frantic arithmetic in her head about co-pays and rent, and whether she could afford to get sick. The relocation consultant said she has a waiting list now, mostly healthcare workers who feel like they are working in a war zone without body armor. They come home from 12-hour shifts, she said, and they cannot sleep, replaying the patients they could not save because a form was denied. They are leaving behind signing bonuses because the mental toll is no longer worth it. Surveys of the profession repeatedly find large shares of younger nurses open to leaving for jobs abroad. That is not the grumbling of a few disgruntled employees. That is an existential threat to the American healthcare system. The Association of American Medical Colleges projects a shortage of up to 86,000 physicians by 2036, and nurses are fleeing faster than they can be trained. We are exporting our life-saving expertise because we refuse to stop the vampires from draining our patients dry. But healthcare is only one piece of this decaying mosaic. The second pillar of the exodus is the relentless erosion of safety, not just on our streets but in the very institutions where we send our children to learn. The unthinkable has become so routine that we have almost stopped noticing, but parents have not. According to the K-12 school shooting database, which meticulously tracks every incident of gunfire on school grounds, the number of school shootings has risen year after year, with 2023 and 2024 setting horrifying new records. The database records not just fatalities, but every instance of a gun on campus, from suicides to accidental discharges. and the numbers for those years shattered all previous records, with over 400 incidents each year. That is more than one per school day. Sit with that image. A country so soaked in this particular horror that a gun appears on a campus more often than the sun rises on a school morning. But the statistic that captures the psychological toll is this. More than 95% of American public schools now conduct active shooter drills. Think about that for a moment. In no other developed country on earth do small children, as young as 4 and 5 years old, regularly practice hiding in closets, crouching behind desks, learning to be absolutely silent so that a bad man with a gun does not find them. They learn to hold their breath. They learn not to cry. They learn that the coat closet with the smell of wet mittens and lost lunchboxes might one day be the thing that keeps them alive. This is not a drill for a fire or a tornado. This is a drill to prepare for a human predator who intends to murder them. According to a study by the National Association of School Psychologists, these drills cause measurable trauma in children as young as 4, including heightened anxiety, sleep disorders, and regressive behaviors. We are deliberately traumatizing a generation of children because we cannot muster the will to stop the slaughter. I recently heard the story of a young family who decided to leave the United States for good. The parents, both professionals, had a 7-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter. One evening, in that soft hour after supper, when the light goes golden and low, they found the children playing quietly in the basement. The son had taken it upon himself to coach his little sister through an intruder drill. He was showing her how to hide behind the couch, how to stay still, how to not make a sound, pressing a small finger to his lips, patting the air with his hand to tell her lower, lower, quieter. And when the parents asked what they were doing, the boy said, matter-of-factly, without a trace of alarm, I'm teaching her what to do when the bad man comes to school. The father told me that he later found the children's drawings, not of sunny skies and stick figures, but of dark rooms with red lines and a big angry stick figure with a black box in his hand. The son had labeled the drawing Bad Man Day. The father said he stood in the hallway holding that piece of paper for a long time and something in his chest simply gave way, like a rope that had been fraying for years, finally parting strand by strand. That night, the parents sat at the kitchen table and quietly made the decision to leave. They did not shout. They did not debate politics. They just held hands and wept at the loss of their homeland, then started liquidating everything. They are now in New Zealand, and the son is learning rugby and has not mentioned bad men in 6 months. A 7-year-old passing on survival tactics as if it were a game of hide and seek. That moment, the parents said, was the instant they knew they had to leave. They could no longer raise their children in a society where such trauma is considered normal. And they are not alone. A recent study by the Pew Research Center found that 27% of parents with school-age children cite fear of violence as a primary motivation for considering emigration. Among mothers of children under 10, some surveys push that number to 35%. The American Academy of Pediatrics has declared school shootings a public health crisis, and its emergency meeting on the youth mental health crisis determined that the threat of school shootings is a core factor in youth anxiety. We are raising a generation of children who practice for their own deaths, and then we wonder why birth rates are plummeting and families are fleeing. And if you dare to think the terror stops at school, consider the broader breakdown of civil order. Even though national violent crime has actually eased back down from its 2020 and 2021 spike, the sense of disorder in many major cities has not. The numbers may have cooled on paper, but the feeling in the gut of the ordinary citizen has not, and that feeling is its own kind of data. Carjackings, smash-and-grab robberies, random attacks on public transit, the recorded incidents in certain corridors have made urban life feel like a daily gamble. In Philadelphia, flash mob robberies shut down entire commercial corridors in 2023. In Chicago, carjackings roughly tripled during the pandemic years, and in many cases the perpetrators are teenagers who face few real consequences. The Council on Criminal Justice has documented how the 2020 surge in homicides reversed years of progress, even though rates have since come down. The National Retail Federation reports that organized retail crime has reached epidemic levels, with brazen theft rings operating with near-total impunity in states that have decriminalized low-level theft. You have seen the videos, the crowbars and the shattered glass display cases, the men strolling out with armfuls of merchandise as calmly as if they were carrying groceries, and not a soul lifting a finger to stop them. Stores are closing in droves, leaving behind what retail analysts now call retail deserts, areas where you cannot even buy basic necessities without driving miles and risking your safety. The plywood goes up over the windows, the parking lots crack and weed over, and a neighborhood that once had a pharmacy and a market becomes a place you hurry through and do not stop. I remember the 1970s when New York City was considered a dangerous mess. The graffiti on the subway cars, the burned-out blocks, but at least you could walk through Central Park in daylight without fearing for your life. There was a rough energy to it, a menace, yes, but also a sense that the city was alive and would pull through. Today, I hear from residents of Portland and San Francisco who say they no longer go out after dark, who carry mace and tactical flashlights just to walk the dog around their own block. They tell me they scan the street the way a sailor scans the sky before a storm, reading the signs, judging when it is safe to venture out. And yet the official response from many city governments has been to defund the police and release repeat offenders without bail, creating a revolving door of chaos that punishes the law-abiding and emboldens the criminal. This is not freedom. This is a surrender of public space to lawlessness. Americans are waking up to the reality that the social order they once took for granted is disintegrating before their eyes. Now, let us turn to the economic engine of this mass departure. And the numbers here are even more devastating. We have been tracking the phenomenon of the functionally unemployed for years now, and the latest data confirms our worst fears. While the administration crows about a low headline unemployment rate of 4.2%, the real story is buried in the U6 unemployment rate, which includes those marginally attached to the labor force and those working part-time for economic reasons. That number, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, sits at a much higher 7.5%. But even that figure is a grotesque understatement, because it does not capture the quality of the jobs being created. The Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity, a nonpartisan think tank, has developed a metric called the true rate of unemployment, which measures the percentage of workers who are functionally unemployed, meaning they are either jobless or earning below a living wage. Their latest report, released just weeks ago, shows that a record 24% of American workers fall into this category. Nearly 1 out of every 4 working Americans is not earning enough to cover the basic cost of living. The Institute's methodology combines official BLS data with a living wage threshold that varies by county. In my last interview with the Institute's director, he explained that the official rate counts someone working 10 hours a week at minimum wage as employed, but that person cannot afford food, rent, or childcare. He said it with a kind of tired anger in his voice, a man who has spent his career watching the official story drift further and further from the lived one. That figure means that roughly 40 million working-age Americans are functionally destitute, and these are not all high school dropouts. They include college graduates shackled to gig apps and part-time retail jobs with unpredictable schedules, people with diplomas hanging on the wall and student loans hanging around their necks, driving strangers around at midnight to make rent. The American Staffing Association reports that the number of workers in temporary, contingent jobs has surged to over 20 million, the highest ever, and those jobs offer zero benefits, zero security, and zero path upward. They are trapped in a purgatory of poverty wages, gig work with no benefits, and part-time hours that fluctuate at the employer's whim, a schedule that lands on their phone at the last minute like a verdict, 28 hours one week and 11 the next, impossible to plan a life around. This is the real economy, not the fantasy land of Wall Street records and GDP revisions, and the layoffs are cascading. According to a report from Challenger, Gray and Christmas, the preeminent outplacement firm that tracks job cut announcements, American companies have announced over 744,000 job cuts in just the first half of 2025. That represents roughly an 80% increase over the same period last year, and it is the highest level of announced layoffs since the pandemic-induced carnage of 2020. The sectors being hit are the ones that once offered stable middle-class careers: technology, media, financial services, and retail. Intel announced 12,000 layoffs. Google, Amazon, and Meta continue their silent rolling layoffs that never make the front page. Citigroup is cutting 20,000 over 2 years. Ford and General Motors are idling plants as demand for their overpriced vehicles evaporates. These are not seasonal adjustments. These are permanent structural eliminations of white-collar jobs. The official narrative says the economy is strong, but tell that to the 40-year-old project manager with a mortgage and 2 kids who just got a pink slip and is now competing against 200 applicants for every opening. Tell it to the man who dresses in the suit he no longer needs, sits at the kitchen table sending out resumes into the silence, and hears nothing back but the automated rejection that arrives at 3 in the morning. The Bureau of Labor Statistics JOLTS report shows job openings plummeting, and the ratio of openings to unemployed workers has fallen from 2 to 1 to below 1.2 to 1. The cushion is gone. The white-collar recession that analysts have warned about for 2 years is now in full swing, and the pain is just beginning. Meanwhile, the cost of everything that sustains life continues its relentless ascent. The Bureau of Labor Statistics may claim inflation has cooled to around 3%, but that is a statistical fabrication built on hedonic adjustments and substitution biases. If you measure inflation the way it was measured in 1980 using the old methodology that tracks the actual out-of-pocket expenses of a typical household, the true inflation rate has been running closer to 10% annually for the past 3 years. John Williams' Shadow Government Statistics website tracks this precisely, and his chart shows that since 2008, the real cost of living has been rising at a rate that the official numbers deliberately hide. The American people feel it every time they go to the grocery store. They feel it in the pit of the stomach at the checkout lane, watching the total climb higher than they braced for, quietly setting an item back on the belt. A basket of basic staples, eggs, milk, bread, ground beef, fresh vegetables, now cost between 50 and 70% more than it did in 2021. I keep a folder of grocery receipts that viewers send me, and the deterioration is staggering. I spread them out on my desk sometimes, the thin curling paper, the faded ink, and I read them like a captain reads the barometer, watching the pressure drop. A typical family of 4 used to spend $150 a week on a basic healthy basket. Now that same basket, with no extras, runs $250 or more. Eggs, a staple protein, have become a luxury. I remember when a dozen eggs was 99 cents. I remember the egg aisle in the 1970s. A dozen large eggs were 69 cents at the AANDP. And I remember the cold of that dairy case, the fog on the glass, my mother counting coins into the cashier's hand. Even as late as 2020, you could get them for $1. Now, due to avian flu, supply chain constraints, and corporate price gouging, a dozen often rings up at $4.50, and in some regions, $7. The USDA's own data shows wholesale egg prices tripling in 2023, but retail prices never came back down. That is called price stickiness, and it is a euphemism for theft. Prices go up like a rocket and come down like a feather, if they come down at all. Beef prices have hit all-time highs, with the average price of ground beef surpassing $5 a pound. Ground beef averaged $3.50 in 2019, now it is $5.50 and climbing. The cattle industry blames drought and feed costs, but the profit margins of the Big Four meat packers, Tyson, JBS, Cargill, National Beef, have expanded dramatically. That is not supply and demand. That is monopoly power. A recent report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service shows that food-at-home prices have risen by 25% cumulatively since the start of the so-called recovery. But even that official number masks the true sting at the checkout lane, the small daily humiliation of a working parent doing the math over a shopping cart and putting the meat back for the cheaper starch. And then there is the housing catastrophe. The American dream of homeownership has been murdered by the Federal Reserve's decade of zero-interest rate policy, followed by the fastest rate-hiking cycle in 40 years. Home prices, as measured by the Case-Shiller National Home Price Index, have soared to levels that are simply unattainable for the vast majority of working families. The median existing home price in the United States now sits above $400,000, a figure that requires an annual income of well over $100,000 to comfortably afford with a 30-year fixed mortgage at 7%. But median household income is stuck at around $80,000. The math does not work. It simply does not work, no matter how many times a young couple sits at the table with a calculator and a legal pad and runs the numbers again, hoping the answer will change. The National Association of Realtors Affordability Index has fallen to its lowest level since the pre-bubble peak of 2006. First-time homebuyers have been locked out, standing at the open house with the warm smell of fresh paint in their noses, knowing they will never hold the keys. Rents have followed the same trajectory, with the Zillow Observed Rent Index showing national median rent up 33% since 2019. Landlords, emboldened by the corporate takeover of single-family rentals, are squeezing tenants with annual double-digit increases. And the corporate buyers, the BlackRocks, the Invitation Homes, the Progress Residentials, they are not just passive profit takers. They are using algorithmic pricing software to coordinate rent hikes across entire metropolitan areas, a practice that several state attorneys general are now investigating as a form of illegal price fixing. In 2020, institutional investors bought 1 in every 7 homes sold in some markets, and they have never stopped. They pay cash, outbidding families, then turn around and rent the homes out at extortionate rates. Imagine the young family that saved for years, that finally makes an offer on a modest starter home, only to be beaten to the punch by a fund that will never live in it, that sees it not as a hearth but as a line item, a yield. The real estate analytics firm John Burns Research estimates that institutional landlords now control 3% of all single-family rentals nationally, but in fast-growing Sunbelt cities like Atlanta, Phoenix, and Charlotte, that share is 20% or higher. A recent report by the Government Accountability Office found that rent increases for corporate-owned homes consistently outpace the market. The result is a surge in evictions. According to data from the Eviction Lab at Princeton University, eviction filings in many major cities have exceeded pre-pandemic levels by 20 to 40%. Families are being tossed onto the street with nowhere to go, their furniture stacked on the curb in the rain, children watching from the back seat as strangers pick through what used to be a home. Homelessness has surged to the highest level on record, with more than 770,000 people counted on a single night in 2024, the highest number since the federal government began its annual tally in 2007, and a figure that everyone knows is an undercount. When I was a young man, a working-class family could afford a modest home in a decent neighborhood, and the mortgage payment was a quarter of the father's paycheck. That was the American bargain. You worked, you saved, you signed the papers, and the roof over your head was yours. Today, that bargain is a cruel joke. Millions of Americans are now rent-burdened, paying more than 30% of their income on shelter, and a growing number are severely rent-burdened, paying more than 50%, living one late paycheck away from the curb. The desperation is a powerful motivator to seek a life in a country where housing is not a tool of financialized extraction. Now, pile on top of this the newly activated trade tariffs that are acting as a tax on every American consumer. The Yale Budget Lab has calculated that the combined tariffs imposed and threatened will cost the average American household an additional $2,300 per year in higher prices, and that is a conservative estimate. For a family of four in the middle of the country, it is likely closer to $3,000. That is a family vacation, a car repair, a month of groceries, quietly siphoned away and hidden inside the price of everything they touch. Categories like clothing, footwear, furniture, and electronics, which are predominantly imported, are seeing particularly brutal price hikes. The Footwear Distributors and Retailers of America warns that tariffs on shoes could rise by as much as 37%, adding $50 to a $130 pair of sneakers. The Consumer Technology Association says that tariffs on electronics would raise the cost of a typical laptop by $200. Clothing prices are projected to jump 25 to 35%, so that the simple act of dressing a growing child for a new school year becomes another line in a ledger that no longer balances. The average new vehicle price, already bloated beyond reason, could increase by another $5,000 as tariffs on steel and aluminum and finished autos cascade through the supply chain. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation estimates that a base model Toyota Camry could jump from $28,000 to $35,000 overnight. And with auto loan rates already at 7 to 8%, the monthly payment for a new car would push past $800, a number that forces millions of families to just hang on to their aging clunkers and pray, coaxing another year out of a tired engine, listening for every new rattle with dread. And who bears the brunt of this? It is the middle and lower classes, whose disposable income is already evaporating. The so-called trade war is nothing more than a regressive consumption tax, wrapped in jingoistic rhetoric, and the architects of this disaster are the same political elites who parade around as champions of the working man, while robbing him blind. All these forces, the healthcare predation, the safety collapse, the wage stagnation, the inflation theft, the housing extortion, and the tariff taxes, are converging into a perfect storm of hopelessness. They do not arrive one at a time, politely, in single file. They arrive together, wave upon wave, until the deck is awash and there is no dry footing left anywhere. And when hope dies, people leave. I want to share with you something that a longtime contact of mine, a real estate agent who specializes in helping Americans relocate to Costa Rica, told me recently. She said she has never seen anything like the wave of inquiries she is now handling. Her clients are not the typical retirees seeking a sunny beach. They are young families, psychiatrists, engineers, business owners, all of whom have reached a breaking point. She told me about 1 week in March when she received 80 serious inquiry calls from the U.S., up from 15 the same week the year before. She had to hire 2 new assistants just to handle the volume, and she said the phone would ring before she had finished her morning coffee and would not stop until well after dark. One client, a psychiatrist who works with troubled teenagers, told her, "I have lost all hope. My patients have lost hope, and I cannot be of service to them if I do not believe things will get better. I am saving myself." Let those words settle for a moment. That is not a frivolous vacationer. That is a mental health professional. Someone trained to find pathways to resilience. Someone whose entire calling is to sit across from despair and light a way out of it, who has concluded that the American environment is too toxic to heal. And she is not alone. I spoke to a couple from Indiana, a school teacher and a software developer, who sold their modest home for $350,000 and used the proceeds to buy a small farm in Costa Rica outright with enough left over to start an eco-lodge. They told me they still remember the last morning in the empty house, the echo of their footsteps on the bare floors, the pale rectangles on the walls where the pictures used to hang. They told me we were one medical crisis away from bankruptcy, and our daughter was coming home from kindergarten with lockdown nightmares. We chose life. These are the rational ones. They are not running away. They are running toward a future that America can no longer provide. International relocation firms are reporting record inquiry. When Irrational Living website, which has tracked expatriation trends for decades, saw its American traffic explode by over 300% in the past 2 years. The Association of Americans Resident Overseas reports that its membership has doubled in 3 years, and the waiting list for information sessions is months long. The most popular destinations are not just the typical Costa Rica and Mexico, but Portugal, Spain, Scotland, New Zealand, Uruguay, Panama, Malaysia, and even Albania. One relocation expert told me, "We are seeing people who never thought they would leave, grandparents learning Spanish on Duolingo, entire families selling everything on Facebook Marketplace. I picture those living rooms stripped bare, the sofa gone, the china gone, the strangers coming to the door to carry off a lifetime piece by piece for pennies on the dollar. Also, a family can buy the tickets out. This is a mass migration in slow motion, and it will accelerate as the economy weakens further." Meanwhile, the American political class touts a booming stock market and a low headline unemployment rate as if those metrics have any bearing on the daily reality of the vast majority. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell testified before Congress just last month, claiming that the economy is on a solid footing and that the labor market is in a good place. He said, "The labor market has come into better balance and wage increases are moderating. That is newspeak for you will not get a raise and your job is precarious." I watched him say it. The measured voice, the careful cadence, the practiced calm of a man reading depth soundings from a bridge while the passengers below feel the water rising around their ankles. He also said, "Inflation expectations remain well anchored." But the New York Fed's latest Consumer Expectations Survey shows median 3-year inflation expectations at 3.5%, up from 2.7% pre-pandemic. People do not believe the Fed, and they are right not to. What he failed to mention is that the net worth gains from the stock market boom have accrued almost entirely to the top 10% of households, who own 93% of all equities. The bottom 50% of Americans own less than 1% of the stock market. For them, the booming stock market is an abstraction that mocks their weekly struggle to fill a grocery cart, a set of green numbers scrolling across a screen in a language spoken by people they will never meet. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has repeatedly insisted that the economy is on solid footing and that the administration has engineered a historic boom. He stood at a podium and told the nation the recovery was real, and in one briefing he called the U.S. economy the envy of the world. The envy of the world. Say that to the family at the food bank, say it to the nurse packing her life into 2 suitcases, and watch the words curdle in the air. But when you look at the misery index, inflation plus unemployment, it sits at levels that historically signal recession. The Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index has plunged, and the Expectations Subindex, which measures short-term outlook, is below the threshold that has preceded every recession since 1980. You can keep believing him if you want, but the record 24% functional unemployment rate tells a different story. The record bankruptcy filings tell a different story. The lines at food banks, which are longer today than they were at the peak of the pandemic, tell a different story. Snaking around the building in the cold, quiet, orderly, full of people who never once imagined they would stand in such a line. The Federal Reserve's own survey of household economics and decision-making found that 37% of adults would struggle to cover an unexpected $400 emergency expense. That is not a strong economy, that is a society on the edge of collapse. And the political theater that distracts us while this rot deepens is perhaps the most infuriating part. Every week the news cycle churns with a new cultural firestorm, a new scandal, a new outrage, designed to keep us split into warring tribes while the kleptocracy continues its looting. I watch the news and see politicians screaming about bathrooms and book bans while the real thieves empty the treasury, and it is like watching a food fight break out in the dining room of a ship that is quietly going down by the stern. I have been observing this for over 5 decades, and I can tell you with certainty that the level of division, the raw anger, the sense of betrayal, is more intense now than at any point since the late 1960s. Back then, the nation was torn apart by an unpopular war and racial strife, but there was still a functioning middle class, still a sense that if you worked hard, you could get ahead. There was still a floor under people, a bottom you could stand on even when the roof was leaking. Today, that belief is dead. A recent survey from the American Psychological Association found that 76% of adults reported that the future of the nation is a significant source of stress in their lives. 76%. And that same survey found that 66% feel that the political climate is a significant source of stress, up from 52% before the 2016 election. This constant cortisol spike is making us sick. You can see it in the clenched jaws, the short tempers, the sleepless nights, a whole nation grinding its teeth in the dark. And that anxiety is manifesting in a surge of mental health crises, of substance abuse, of what researchers call deaths of despair. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, drug overdose deaths, though finally falling from their 2023 peak of over 110,000, still claimed roughly 80,000 lives in the most recent 12-month period. Add to that around 49,000 suicides and 70,000 alcohol-related deaths a year, and you have close to 200,000 Americans each year dying from what researchers call deaths of despair, the equivalent of erasing a mid-sized city, every man, woman, and child in it, gone in a single year and repeated the next. And the suicide rate among young people ages 10 to 24 has increased 56% in the last decade. We are not just losing our wealth, we are losing our will to live. This is the human cost of a society that has abandoned its people. I remember the 1970s very well. I remember the gas lines snaking around blocks under gray skies, and you could smell the exhaust and the desperation, that acrid haze hanging over the pumps, the drivers leaning on their horns, the odd and even license plate days that ruled our lives. I was a teenager, sitting in the back of my father's Oldsmobile, watching him stare at the fuel gauge with a clenched jaw, his knuckles white on the wheel, the radio murmuring bad news that he would reach over and switch off. Inflation was eating our savings, and my parents argued about money at the kitchen table, their voices low and tight after they thought we had gone to bed, but they never once suggested leaving. That thought was alien. It never crossed the threshold of what was thinkable. America might be down, but it was still home, still the land of possibility. I also remember that nobody talked about leaving the country. The idea of emigrating to escape the malaise was almost unheard of. America was still seen as the place of last resort, the ultimate refuge, the harbor everyone else was trying to reach. Today, that script has been flipped. America is now the place people are desperate to escape. What changed? The social contract was ripped up. The elite consensus shifted from a broad-based prosperity model, the kind of capitalism that built the great middle class after World War II, to a predatory financialized casino capitalism that extracts wealth from the real economy and concentrates it in the hands of a tiny globalist overclass. The safety nets were shredded, the unions were busted, the trade deals were written to ship jobs overseas. The regulatory agencies were captured by the very industries they were supposed to police. And the central bank, the Federal Reserve, has become an engine of inequality, pumping trillions of dollars into the financial markets while the real economy suffocated. Every single one of these betrayals was foretold by anyone willing to read the data honestly. The warning was clear that the inflation unleashed by reckless money printing would not be transitory, that it would prove to be far, far worse than anything experienced in the 1970s. The warning was clear that the stock market froth would eventually meet its reckoning, and that the housing bubble was built on sand. I remember 2008 too. The phone calls from friends who had lost everything, the neighbors whose homes went dark and empty one after another down the street, the way the whole edifice seemed solid right up until the morning it was not. And now, as those predictions resolve into stark reality, the final stage is revealed. The people, the human capital, are beginning to drain away. I take no pleasure in being right. It is a heavy burden to see the train wreck coming and to sound the alarm while others call you a charlatan. But the truth cannot be hidden forever. And the Exodus is the ultimate confirmation that our analysis was correct. And here is the truly terrifying part. The Exodus we are witnessing today is just the tip of the iceberg. The people leaving now are the early adopters, the ones with the resources, the passports, the remote employability, the liquid assets to start a new life abroad. They are the ones who could reach the lifeboats first, the ones standing nearest the rail when the order came. But as conditions deteriorate further, and they will deteriorate further, the flood will become a tidal wave. We are already seeing the formation of what some economists call a doom loop. As the most productive, educated, and financially stable citizens leave, the tax base erodes. As the tax base erodes, public services, police, fire, infrastructure, schools decline even faster. As public services decline, quality of life plunges further, pushing even more people to leave. Round and round it goes. Each turn of the wheel, a little faster and a little lower, water feeding on water. This cycle has hollowed out many nations in history, and it is now taking hold in the United States. Cities like San Francisco, Portland, and Chicago are already caught in the early stages of this spiral. San Francisco's downtown office vacancy rate is over 36%, a record, and the city is losing both businesses and residents. You can walk those downtown blocks at midday now and hear your own footsteps echo off the towers of empty glass, the lobbies dark, the ground floor cafes papered over. The outmigration from California has accelerated, with the state losing a congressional seat for the first time in history after the 2020 census, and the trend has only intensified. Companies like Oracle, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and Tesla have moved their headquarters to Texas and elsewhere, taking thousands of jobs with them. Portland's retail core has been gutted by crime and defunded policing. Chicago's public schools are hemorrhaging students as families flee the violence and dysfunction. The elite response is not to fix the underlying problems, but to double down on the very policies that caused them, while constructing a narrative that everything is fine, rearranging the deck chairs and painting fresh smiles on the crew, even as the deck goes under. And here is the honest, painful caveat that few dare to speak. Not everyone can escape. The poor, the elderly, the disabled, they are trapped. The escape hatch is only open to those with capital, credentials, and the right passports. For the millions who remain, the hollowing out will mean even higher tax burdens on a shrinking base, worse services, longer 9/11 response times, more boarded-up storefronts, and a spiral into third-world status. That is the grim reality, and I do not say it to be cruel. I say it so you understand the stakes. If you have the means to leave, you are already considering it. If you do not, you need to steel yourself for a very dark period ahead. What does it all mean for you, the viewer, the person who may not have the luxury of an escape hatch? It means the time to prepare is now. I am not here to offer hollow reassurances. I am here to give you the unvarnished truth, the way an old sailor gives it, plainly, without ornament, because your survival may depend on hearing it clearly. The United States is becoming a country that people do not want to live in anymore, and the trend is accelerating. The politicians and the central bankers will continue to gaslight you with cherry-picked data and empty promises. They will tell you that the job market is resilient, that inflation is under control, that America remains the indispensable nation, but the exodus of your fellow citizens tells a different story. It is a silent, powerful repudiation of the entire system. When a psychiatrist gives up hope, when a mother teaches her 4-year-old to hide from shooters, when a nurse moves to Scotland so her special needs child can have a safer, more humane life, the verdict is in. These are not the choices of frightened or foolish people. These are the choices of the clear-eyed, made at kitchen tables, in the small hours, after every other option has been exhausted. The American experiment, in its current form, has failed the very people it was meant to serve. We are sailing into uncharted waters, and the storm clouds are gathering on every horizon. The bumpy ride we have long forecast has arrived, and it will only get more violent from here. The ship of state is not just taking on water. It is breaking apart on a reef of debt and deceit, the timbers splitting with a sound you feel in your bones, and the lifeboats are being launched by the very people who were supposed to keep the vessel afloat. The froth in asset prices is dissolving, and the real economy is being exposed as a Potemkin village, a painted facade with nothing behind it but rot and empty rooms. The unsustainable entitlements, $70 trillion in unfunded liabilities, are an actuarial nightmare that can only end in default or hyperinflation. The hollowed-out industrial base, the fraying social cohesion, the open borders that have allowed a flood of cheap labor to depress wages, all of it is converging, and the exodus is the canary in the coal mine. If the most productive citizens are fleeing, what does that say about the future value of the US dollar, of US equities, of US real estate? I have lived long enough to see empires crumble, and I tell you, the signs are unmistakable. I have watched the tide go out slowly, so slowly that most people mistook it for calm, never realizing that the sea pulling back from the shore is the surest warning that a great wave is coming. This is not a cyclical downturn. This is a structural unwinding of a debt-financed fantasy that has lasted for decades. And the smart money, the human capital, is heading for the exits, while the exits still exist. I wish I could offer a brighter outlook. I really do. I wish I could tell you that prices will level off, that communities will heal, that the political class will rediscover a sense of duty. I would give a great deal to be wrong, to have all of this dismissed someday as the ravings of a pessimistic old man. But I have seen too much, tracked too many data series, and spoken to too many experts to indulge in such comfortable delusions. The trajectory is downward, and the pace is picking up. Thank you for watching. What are your thoughts on this unfolding disaster? Share them in the comments below and let us know if you or someone you know has made the difficult decision to leave. Your stories are a powerful testament to the times we are living through, and I read them every one because they are the truest record of this moment that exists anywhere. And if you found this analysis valuable, we ask for your support with a thumbs up and a subscription, so you never miss our next deep dive into the data the establishment wants to hide. Together, we can shine a light on the truth even when that truth is painful. I will see you in the next video.